Jonny, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks for having me, Joe. I'm excited about this. Thank you.
So after COVID, it seemed that
Mm.
Stoic philosophy was very in vogue. It seemed that every fitness influencer was apparently Marcus Aurelius incarnate. Now we're a
Mm.
few years on. Which philosophy or philosopher is quite fashionable?
Ooh, it's difficult. It's a good question, actually. And I think during COVID, I think just philosophy and wellness generally just kind of like blew up. I think because some people were interested in learning about that kind of stuff. I think people want to learn about how to control their minds and get a bit more discipline. I think. But I think you're absolutely right. Stoicism, particularly in the last 5 or 6 years, has been huge with Ryan Holiday and Tim Ferriss really popularizing it. But of course, I think Marcus Aurelius's meditations, I think, have been in the top 10 philosophy books for the last 5 years or so. So yeah, you're right. But today I do feel as though there is a slight pushback against that philosophy. I think possibly wrongly, although there are elements of Stoicism which definitely lend itself to this interpretation. I think Stoicism has become to be interpreted as being a kind of like a hustle philosophy, a kind of like maximize your time here and do the 5 to 9 before the 9 to 5. And I feel as though there's a pushback against that. And I think it's existed for a long time. Byung-Chul Han's book, The Burnout Society, really kind of like put the finger on the pulse, really, where he kind of said that this is making us anxious, it's making us unhappy, and making us sad. So I feel as though there's a pushback against that with a combination of books, really. Like I interviewed a guy called Matt Haig, an author called Matt Haig, on Friday. He's wrote this book called The Midnight Library, which sold like 14 million copies. And he said to me that most of those were sold during COVID. And The Midnight Library is a book which is very much about kind of recognizing your limits and recognizing what you can and what you cannot do in the time that we have allotted to us. And there's no point living with regret, because every life will have a degree of failure and of insufficiency, and you cannot do everything in one life. And I think that was a very popular book. And then, of course, Oliver Berkman wrote a book called 4,000 Weeks, where he really articulated that in the non-fiction space, where the book's title is 4,000 Weeks. The idea is, on average, most people have about 4,000 weeks to spend. And if you weigh up your life like that and you discount all the things you have to do, like working and looking after dependents, whatever and stuff, you only have a few weeks that you can devote to things. And so inevitably you will fail at something. You cannot be everything to everybody. You cannot live 100 lives. So commit to something. So I feel as though that is where the pushback is going now, towards that kind of recognizing your limits philosophy. And of course, also in the background, which is interesting, a very interesting phenomenon, is this kind of return to what was called cultural Christianity. So there's a growing, or what's the word I want, loud voice, where we're saying that we've moved away from Christian values and our traditional values, and therefore that's why the West, whatever that means, is suffering. And so there is a trying like this reinterpretation of Christian values. Jordan Peterson, of course, is leading that charge. But it's also seen in Ben Shapiro, and even historians like Tom Holland, not the Spider-Man Tom Holland, the historian Spider-Man. The historian Tom Holland. He wrote a book called Dominion, which basically lays out the argument that all of our institutions and our philosophies and even our mindset was built under Christian theology, really. And so that's the other kind of thread which is interesting. I'm seeing at the moment, this kind of cultural Christianity, that we need Christianity to have whatever we value in the West, including humanism, which is ironic because humanism is anti-religion. And then, of course, that anti-hustle mentality. So sorry, a long answer. You've really got to jump in when I rap, because you throw me a morsel of goat there.
A long answer, but a good answer. So
Thank you.
if we think Stoicism, the sort of maximalist life, and now we're seeing this pendulum swing, as you have noted, what is most aligned with general philosophy? Like, can you do philosophy if you're on the grind all the time? Do you need more leisure time to do philosophy, to think? And then surely if you are leisuring, then you are not producing and striving.
Yes, you need time to think, and you need space to think. And of course, like we in this day and age, we don't give ourselves that time to think. I'm as bad as anybody else. I spend every other minute on my phone, on social media, and busying myself with TV, whatever. And if you don't give yourself that time to think, and I like to think that I get my time to think by talking with other people, like conversations like this. I really do a lot of my thinking through a dialectic, through a conversation like this, which is really good. But no, you're absolutely right. So the ancient Greek roots of the word leisure actually is connected with schooling. It's school. The word school that we associate today was leisure in ancient Greece. So Aristotle had this famous line where he says, "You have to go to work so that you can enjoy your school time, your leisure." And I think that's an interesting way of spinning it, because we don't view leisure time as being this kind of self-cultivation, growing your wisdom, growing your philosophy. So I think that is important. And I mean, yes, I would say, as a philosopher, I would say that if we don't spend that time reflecting on ideas, then we are much worse off it. I'm reminded of Hannah Arendt, who argues that if you reduce people to drones, just purely economic units, Homo economicus, then people are sad, people are anxious, and people are upset, they're disconnected. And of course, her book argues that is the fertile ground in which fascism grows. That when people are unphilosophical, unreflective, and are reduced to purely economic units, then that's when they can be turned into fascist units, really. So it's all right. Yeah. I kind of lost track of your question. Sorry, but
no, that's actually quite an interesting rabbit hole in which we seem to be diving down headfirst. But the reducing individuals to their economic utility, leading towards the right on the political spectrum into fascism. If we look at communist Russia, they really reduced people down to their economic, and everyone was assigned a color, and you would go into work on whatever day your color was assigned, and it actually broke up the family. There was no collective time. I think Oliver Bergman's written about it quite extensively. So if we don't have enough time to think, to philosophize, if that's going to then reach to the right, surely it also reaches to the left as well.
Both ways. I mean, I often talk about, I mentioned this in one of my videos recently, that actually I feel as though a very philosophical mindset is to appreciate nuance and appreciate complexity, and to realize how difficult and complicated almost everything in life, particularly politics. And I think both extreme left and extreme right, they are unified in reaching for simple answers, that they want something they can grab onto, which is, it makes sense, and some kind of certainty. And of course, democracy especially doesn't work like that. Democracy is a slow-moving tanker. It is boring, but largely the decisions are agreed upon. They are largely reversible, and they are very small, piecemeal and stuff, so that they're not kind of like a guillotine to the neck, which is irreversible and drastic. And I think you're right. The left and the right are equally guilty of that. The French Revolution was left, and fascist Germany was the right. Equally, that this craving for simple, totalitarian, both kinds, solutions is natural, because humans don't really like complexity. We don't like the fact that there is no simple answer to things. And on an existential level, that's to do with the universe, and on the political level, it's to do with the fact that sometimes democracies will take 5-10 years, and this is why it's a very dangerous trend in our modern politics, that we feel that things have to be done within the first 2 years of a government's term, whereas actually in reality, meaningful and lasting change happens over a series of governments, often different governments from different areas of the political spectrum. I mean, there's a kind of like an unwritten rule, particularly in UK and American politics as well, where you don't really reverse what the previous administration has done to an extent. You give it a bit of time. And I think that's necessary, because the changes of things, of any legislation, won't be felt for decades, really. But people don't like that. People don't like the idea that the fact that politics is a slow-moving tanker. They want it to be a nimble jet ski. But of course, nimble jet skis are far more dangerous.
If we then see that people don't like the fact that politics is complex, does this feed into what Nietzsche wrote when he talked about people not liking the truth, and they wanted a different point of view? They wanted something more simple.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I wrote about that, the Nietzsche thesis, that did really well actually on Instagram. It's one of my more popular ones, and I think that is true. I have a few neuroscientist friends, and I increasingly view things from a neuroscientific or even an evolutionary point of view. And of course, that would make sense. I don't think the truth and as of itself has no value to humans. That's why we do crave a comfortable falsehood than an uncomfortable truth. Within reason, of course, because sometimes knowing something is actually the case is more beneficial to our survival. That I need to know if there is a snake in the bush. That truth is important to me. I won't just, if someone says to me, "Don't go over there, there's snakes over there," I'm like, I don't believe that. I'm going for a walk. You do need to listen to the truth to that extent. But when it comes to social interaction, social psychology, that's when it becomes really interesting, because the it's kind of like a status game, isn't it? And a kind of like a power dominance hierarchy, a kind of power negotiation, and that's why truth is important in that sense. That's what Nietzsche says, that truth essentially comes down to who is the most powerful in that group, and you want to kind of like to save face towards that person. Your question was, is it important, truth? I can't remember what your question was now. I've rambled myself into a hole.
It was just a segue onto Nietzsche and people not appreciating or wanting the truth or the facts.
Yeah, no, I think that is true. I think people don't really appreciate the truth because what is the value of truth, in a sense that I think maybe we've lost sight of the fact that truth is valuable in itself. But I mean, I am more hopeful about the human race than a lot of people, particularly nowadays. I do feel as though we tend to just oscillate our way forward. In fact, I'm often told that professional swimmers, when they're doing their front crawl through the water, they don't go straight. They're kind of like oscillating left and right, left and right. And I kind of see human progress as like that. We're kind of oscillating our way towards something. And I feel as though, we're oscillating towards this kind of post-truth, kind of everything is fake, AI age and stuff. And I think that there will be a pendulum swing back to, I think you're seeing already, actually, to real life interactions, what you can verify with your own eyes, and kind of like simpler and more local things than this global internet, which is now being seen for the house of mirrors that it is. Thing.
Nietzsche seems to be getting a bit of airtime at the moment amongst people. Was he Hitler's favourite philosopher?
No, he wasn't. Well, he was only because his sister kind of co-opted him. It's a very sad story, Nietzsche, really. He went kind of mad in his later years. We don't entirely know why, because, you can't necessarily date diagnosis, but it looks like he might have something associated with syphilis. That's the best guess we people have. So he went mad and he was put in a home, and his sister was the one looking after him. And so some of his later works, there is an element of kind of like how much should we interpret them as being actually Nietzsche, and how much is, well, A, Nietzsche insane, and B, Nietzsche's sister editing his work. And so Hitler went to visit Nietzsche's sister, and she says that Hitler, he's talking to Hitler, you are the Übermensch, the Superman that Nietzsche was talking about. So Nietzsche never said that. Hitler's sister, who was literally a card-carrying Nazi, she signed up to the party. She thought that Hitler was that, and of course that's why Hitler would have liked it, and some of the Nazis liked Nietzsche. But I would say that a lot of Nazis didn't like Nietzsche, and there were other philosophers of fascism that people liked better. Because he does give a few examples of the Übermensch in his works. He talks about Napoleon, and you can see probably commonalities between Nietzsche and between Hitler and Napoleon. But then he also mentions somebody like Jesus as an Übermensch, which of course is the archetypal difference. Also is the opposite of someone like Hitler. So no, he's not. But I have to say that Nietzsche is so intentionally opaque, so poetic and so lyrical in what he says, that it is very easy to read what you want into him. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why he is so popular among the internet, is that people look at what he says and they say, well, that's me, he's right there and stuff. But actually, if you read the next passage, he almost intentionally contradicts himself. And that's why people love reading him, because he is interesting, he's exciting, he's provocative, but also he wants us to think as the reader. He kind of wants you to make up your own mind. So in some ways, he's presenting a menu of options, and he wants you, the reader, to decide it. But I did a post about the book called The Gay Science recently, and in The Gay Science, he just basically takes the piss out of everything, literally everything. He likes to go about God and about kind of philosophy of the day, about politics, about Christians, about Jews, about Stoics, about you and me, the reader, as well. He's mocking everyone and everything. And that kind of tone runs through Nietzsche, that degree of kind of like, don't accept everything else that exists, make up your own mind. And I think, that's why Nazism kind of jumped upon him. But that's Elizabeth, his sister. And also Bertrand Russell, if I'm honest, as well. Russell wrote this great book called The History of Western Philosophy, and he was very scathing of Nietzsche. But then that's of course when Russell was writing that, he was writing it in the end of at the end of World War II, so he was very sensitive to these kind of fascist ideologies, and they are there if you want to see them. So again, a rambling answer, but he's not a Nazi, but he can be interpreted as being a Nazi.
And that Übermann, which Hitler clung so dearly onto, what did he really mean when he was writing it, if he didn't mean Hitler?
Well, it's somebody who crafts their own story or crafts their own life. It's somebody who will not accept the established truth, talk about truth earlier, and what other people are saying, and actually thinks and does and moves for themselves. that's all that really can be said about the Übermensch, really. And it's existential hero. And he wrote a book called Beyond Good and Evil, where even the ideas of good and evil that we've inherited, right and wrong, you need to think about those yourself. It doesn't mean that you should do evil. It doesn't mean you should murder and kill people, but he just said that, sometimes think about it. Sometimes maybe murder is what you should do. But that's him, and he said everyone has to make up their own decision themselves. And that's as I say, that's all can be said about it. And of course, that has very different flavors. Sometimes that could be a Hitler or a Napoleon. Sometimes that can be a Jesus Christ or a Gandhi. Sometimes it can be a Jordan Peterson. Sometimes it can be a Greta Thunberg. It can be across the whole spectrum of people who are deciding the course of their life. And people like to say that they are the Übermensch because they have decided what Nietzsche meant. But actually, I think Nietzsche would just say, like, just stand up and make your own decisions. I think he would say, and certainly don't do things because that's what the Judeo-Christian understanding says, basically. So he's very scathing of the tradition that we've inherited. To going back to what we said earlier about this kind of cultural Christianity, if they don't do that as well. But sorry.
Probably one of his famous ideas was the death of God, and I love the story about this bathroom where, cause it's quite fun to write "God is dead" on bathrooms. I guess if you're a rebellious teenager, and on the bathroom it said "God is dead" in quotations - Nietzsche, and someone wrote underneath it "Nietzsche is dead - God." But what did
which is ironically Nietzsche's
mean,
point.
though? Yeah.
Well, that's ironically Nietzsche's point, really, that Nietzsche, just like any philosopher, he's joined now this litany of dead philosophers, and you should take his word with a grain of salt as much as anything else, and he is just as fallible and just as interpretable as everybody else. In fact, he wrote, I think, the opening of Beyond Good and Evil. I think it must have been. I think it's Beyond Good and Evil. It's called On the Philosophers, where he basically says all philosophers are just writing their own autobiography. They're writing their own what they think, and you can always say to a philosopher, "Well, that's what you think, and this is what I think." And yeah, Nietzsche thought that, and so God is dead. Is often loved by atheists because they think he's talking literally about God, about a bearded man in a sky. And there's an element of that. He is talking about religion. He's talking about classical theology. But more than that, he's talking about absolutism. He's talking about the idea that there is an answer, there is a one way, there is a should, there is a you have to live like this. There is answers written in stone on tablets that you'll find in the Middle East somewhere. That's just nonsense, you think. There is no absolute. And if you read the passage at the time, it's a very different tone to how it's pulled out, because we often assume that God is dead. It's like, hooray, cheer, let's go to the hills and let's do what we want, make our new utopia and stuff. But actually, Nietzsche puts his finger on the pulse where he realizes that actually this is a very terrifying moment. This is a scary moment, that because it's like we've been led by the hand, like we're children and our parents are holding our hands all of this time. And that's comfortable. It's nice. It's easy to be told what to do and right, go here, wear this, say that. Let's do this now. That's an easy life. But then suddenly, when that hand is gone, that hand evaporates. You're left on your own in the middle of a world which makes no sense, and the rules are scary. And there are people who are big with big sticks, and there are people who are lying and fighting. And so, what do you do then? And here's this passage where we said we're tumbling. We are without up or down. We don't know what's going on. And so I honestly, I'm not the first person to say this. Alistair McIntyre says it as well. It's almost cliche now, but I think we're still grappling with that problem. There is a God-sized hole in society that we don't have any absolute, any certainty, any right and wrong and deontology. I think that means we are kind of floating in freefall a little bit, which is what he diagnosed. But I don't think there's any medication offered, really. So that's what God dead means. It means there is nothing that we can cling to which tells us how to live. We have to decide for ourselves. And for some people, that'll be okay. The Übermensch, they grasp that moment, they enjoy it. For some people, they'll be terrified and they won't ever really make a peace with that fact.
Yeah. Given there's a God-sized hole in society, as you said there, we were discussing just briefly before we started recording about this new rise of interest in Christian ideas, especially coming from Tom Holland, etc. From a philosophical point of view, how do you observe this cultural pendulum swing back from the new atheist movement?
Yeah, it's difficult. I am not a Christian. I'm not religious, traditionally religious in any sense, really. But I do recognize that religion gives ultimately three very good things to people. It gives certainty, which people crave. I talked about neuroscience earlier. Like there is a neuroscientific explanation that people like certainty. We don't do very well when we don't know what's going on. So like certainty, it gives us answers. The second thing, I think it gives us ritual. Rituals are really important. Again, that's been proven by study and study over again, that people like to do things collectively. We like the ritual of going to a football game, or maybe going to the pub every week with our friends, or of course swinging incense around, praying 5 times a day, or thumbing some rosary beads. And the third thing is it gives us is community. That all religions have a sense of unity, a brotherhood, a sisterhood, a unity together. Like in Islam, it's called the Ummah, and St. Paul said, we are one body in Christ. This idea of coming together. And I think that when you pull religion out as a belief system, those three things are now need some kind of solution. And I do feel as though some of those problems are easier to manage than others. For example, I think ritual, you could probably cope with that. You could probably deal with some kind of rituals. There are some things with secular rituals. We have the UK, for example, we're very good at pageantry. It's like people often talk about how they want to get rid of the monarchy, and I see the point. I see why they say that, but I would miss the ritual and the pageantry, because I feel as though that is important to us as a species, but also as a community. That the idea of we like to see the flags waving and doing the coronation and all that kind of stuff. I think it's kind of a ritual that we can get on board with. As I mentioned,
It's a huge part of the British identity, isn't it?
It's part of the British identity, and I think ritual is important to human well-being. The third one, community. I feel as though that again is a manageable, solvable problem. I feel as though we didn't appreciate community as much before COVID, and also when we had the recession and credit crunch and austerity, where we kind of pulled money. The easy money was to pull it out of community spaces and community investment. And I think we're feeling the result of that again now, with this lack of interacting with other people. But of course, the first one is a problem that Nietzsche diagnosed, and the problem that we can't easily overcome at the moment, and that is, how can you get certainty without this objective, metaphysical, out of this world thing telling us that this is the way it is? Without commandments, what do you have? And people have tried to fill that hole a little bit. Kant tried to solve it with secular rationalism and morality. Yuval Harari wrote a book called *Sapiens*, where he talks about narratives, that we just have to commit to narratives. But that's insufficient. Why commit to narratives? And once it is a narrative, once you're aware of a narrative, then you kind of can't accept it. It's kind of like you see the stage graphs, and you can't then jump into the play anymore. So yeah, that's the problem that we are still grappling with, and I think that's the problem that this new Christian movement, this modern cultural Christianity, is trying to solve. I don't have an easy answer to that. If I would, I'd be, I don't know, professor at Oxford.
It's interesting though, the monarchy, and again, I feel as though this is a rabbit hole in which we might head first down in. One of the best things, arguments I've heard about the monarchy is that, aside from the pomp, the pageantry, the tourism, etc., if you ran the structure of the monarchy as a political force across the pond, the president of the United States would have to stop what he's doing, get in a car, drive 15 minutes to a palace, which is much bigger than his own home, or almost as nice as the Houses of Parliament, go in, bow towards Uncle Sam, and then spend the next 30 minutes explaining to Uncle Sam how he is running Uncle Sam's country to the best of Uncle Sam's interests. And then he would have to bow again, and then go, and then get back in the car, and then drive 15 minutes back to his offices. And I just think in terms of not necessarily tall poppy syndrome, but in terms of a stabilizing force of not making the president's king, for example, it just really works for the British political system.
Yes, as having a kind of separation of powers, really. Of course, yes. I mean, of course, the monarchy is essentially like what's the word I want? Capacity of power. I mean, it's a kind of toothless organization. It doesn't do it. And they sign the legislation, but they don't really kind of real power. But yeah, I think you're right, and I think just that there's a history. I don't know what it is. There's a law or some kind of thing. I can't remember. I'll Google it afterwards. Where it says that the longer something has been around, the longer it's likely to stay around. And I feel as though that is the case with things like tradition, like that, the monarchy and things. That the republic counter argument is that just because we have, if we got rid of the monarch, we could still do that pomp and pageantry and celebration and stuff like that. But this is where the inner cynic in me comes out. I don't think we would. That I don't think to build something new from scratch that has the same gravitas and the same pomp and pageantry as the monarchy. I just don't think we would do that. I mean, what is there where in recent modern times where we have that kind of ritual, that kind of pageantry, which is not associated with our tradition? The Olympics, probably, and of course that's 2,000 years old. The Olympics is like, it's ancient. Trying to think of any case. Eurovision. Maybe that's what we could do. Eurovision for those who aren't in Europe, Eurovision is like a singing competition that seems to get most people together. People dress up and like to enjoy it. Or traitors, BBC traitors, maybe.
You said earlier that Nietzsche wrote that philosophers write their own autobiographies in that sense. But is philosophy a verbal activity or is it a reading activity? Because a lot of the philosophy in which you will engage with will be through written text. But if we were to take a lot of the Socratic discourses, we are just reading conversations. So what balance should we strike in trying to be or become philosophers?
Yeah, I'm going to give you a really, really tedious answer, and that's it. It's either or and both, really. I mean, you can do philosophy as just reading it, or writing it. I genuinely think, I'm sure I don't know enough about the history of philosophy, but I'm sure there is a philosopher who probably didn't even engage in teaching or seminars or kept himself to themselves. And mainly read and wrote philosophy. Someone like Aquinas actually probably not dissimilar. I know he was a monk, he lived with other monks when we talk about it. But so you can do that. I honestly think. And there is a tradition in academia of people replying to each other through academic articles. I'm thinking of like John Searle and Saul Kripke and all that lot. They kind of like they interacted with each other through these academic articles. Of course, they met each other as well and talked with each other. So yeah, I think you can do it that way. I think, of course, it can obviously be an entirely verbal thing. The idea that there was no philosophy before literacy, before books, before writing, I think that's nonsense. I think cavemen were talking about the life after death, about theology, and about rudimentary forms of society and legal systems and stuff, even if they weren't codified and stuff. That's all philosophy. And then, of course, where we are today, I think you need both. I think you are impoverished if you do either or and not both, because I think the problem is nowadays, and I do feel that I am part of this problem. I appreciate that we associate philosophy with talking and with YouTube and with social media and stuff. But if you don't do the reading part, I think you do miss a key element of the philosophy, which is the stilling. It's the slowing down. It's the intentionally slowing down. When you read things, there is a pace to it. You can't put reading on 1.5 speed. You have to process it. And of course, there's also a limit. There's a cognitive load to how much you can take when you're reading. When you really read, you have to stop, do other things. And that's when the learning has to be a slow, gradual process. And of course, unlearning, your brain has to filter. Whereas I think when we just talk about things or just watch them on YouTube and social media, you don't get that. So I do think you need to combine it. There is a great meme online where it says that philosophers, remember philosophers, at some point you have to go beyond Instagram quotes and you have to actually read the texts. And I thought, yeah, that's true. You do, because you do have to go away and read. And it bothers me in a slightly snobbish way. And this is where I'm going to get my snob out for everybody. I'm going to say that it does bother me when you see a quote from Nietzsche or from Camus and stuff on social media, and it's got something like 100,000 retweets and stuff. I am cynical whether 100,000 people have actually gone and read the oeuvre of Nietzsche or even Camus' myth of Sisyphus, to be honest. But anyway, that's the inner snob in me, I'm sure.
Speaking of online, have you ever had a philosophical conversation with ChatGPT? Because
yeah.
there was I was watching a video with Gary V was in it, and he was talking about how in the future things will be split between those who can use it, say something like an AI ChatGPT, and those who can't. And he said he was having a conversation where he put a 39-minute prompt into ChatGPT. And I thought, well, that's pretty impressive. And then I was just thinking there as you were talking, I was like, I wonder, you could probably have like a conversation with like a proto Aristotle on ChatGPT.
Yes.
What do you think?
Yes, definitely, you can do. But it is, it's regurgitative, isn't it? AI has to repeat what it has been trained on. And then the debate becomes whether humans can do the same thing. Yes, we are also regurgitative. We are also repeating what we are trained on and stuff. But with AI, it is at least the models at the moment are, overtly so. Now, if we're having a philosophical chat, 99.9% of the time, even in this conversation, has been said better by someone else in history. We are just repeating what other people have said. Whereas ChatGPT says that, as Kierkegaard said, as Aristotle, as Plato said. So it is regurgitative, and it's consciously so, which kind of takes the fun out of, I've had a thought, I've had a feeling, let's us, you two humans bash it out together. So that's the first point. The second point is that I think that it's very, at the moment at least, the current models are very sycophantic. They're very ingratiating. They're deliberately intended to kind of massage your ego. And I think good philosophy, there's an element of not confrontation, of dialectic, of kind of like constructive clashing, that you need to say, well, actually, no, that's wrong, or I think that's wrong, or I think this could be better and stuff. Whereas ChatGPT does that, but it's a little bit ego massaging at the moment. And the third thing, I feel as though at the moment, this is me, ChatGPT 5 at least, and also the other ones, it's become somehow less nimble. Like maybe it's normalized, and maybe my expectations, the low-hanging fruit, have been picked, and I expect too much of it. But I feel as though it doesn't necessarily respond to what I'm saying as much, or get the implications, the nuances, the hidden undertones of what I'm trying to say, which most human interlocutors do pick up on. So those are the three things the same. But then that said, I think it's a really useful tool. It's kind of like it's a good mirror. It's a really good diary in that way. It's kind of like it's a talking diary, isn't it? You can. Sounds like a Harry Potter thing. You can write into GPT and it'll clarify your own thoughts for you. And of course, it's great at writing crappy articles.
That regurgitative nature of ChatGPT is quite interesting, because I was reading an interesting article, and someone was saying that it's just so amazing, ChatGPT, and I can't wait until it's in human form, and so I can give it a hug, sort of situation. And one of the comments underneath was illustrating the fact that it's regurgitative, and what he thinks, the writer of the article, is profound, is actually just from a WordPress blog in 2008 that no one's read. And I just thought, oh my goodness, that's so interesting.
Yeah, well, and of course that's a philosophical problem as well, isn't it? That sometimes philosophers can, say things with the air of, it's kind of like deep fortune cookie wisdom, and oh yeah, that's right, but you hear it in a different person. I'm very lucky that I often think that one of the reasons why one of my social media has been so successful is that I have quite a plummy British accent. People are like, oh, this guy knows what he's talking about because he wears glasses and he's British. And I wonder if like ChatGPT is a little bit like that. It's like, oh, AI, wow, it's saying this kind of stuff. You're right. But I have to say, in defense of AI, that it is far more complicated than that. It's trained on trillions of words and all this data, and it will have compared that 2008 WordPress to other things, and it will have tailored the answer to what you prompted, and also it'll be learning and growing all of the time. But yeah, it's just I mean, just anecdotally, I feel maybe I'm not prompting, maybe I need to download a good prompt guide from LinkedIn, but I just feel as though it's somehow regressed in ChatGPT 5. I think because they're trying to save money by not giving their highest processing models to everybody all of the time. But I don't know. And there is this phenomenon, isn't there, where apparently it's apparently, again, I don't know enough about AI to say if this is conclusive or not. I'm sure someone else will comment on being wrong. But because it's being trained on so much corrupt and crappy data now, it's also now degrading itself. And it's a problem that you often see with chatbots, that eventually they learn the bad things. They learn bad grammar and the bad side of human conversation and rationality, and also nature, and therefore it's regressing to a negative norm, whereas most humans don't do that. But I don't know enough about it. But yes, again, so I'm rambling at you. Jump in.
If I was to look for small talk advice, I wouldn't initially go straight to Aristotle, but he had a good take in that we shouldn't ask what people do for work, and we should instead ask what they do in their leisure time. Why was that?
Yeah, that's a good one, isn't it? That's the leisure one, isn't it, dude? It goes back to what we said earlier about defining yourself as a Homo economicus. I think Aristotle agreed that the meaning of life is not to be found in making money for the current world order. And I think that's fairly uncontroversial as an idea. And I think that when we view ourselves as an economic unit to add digits to the current world order, it kind of, it's unhappy. You feel existentially lost. And I think Aristotle's point is actually we should define people by leisure more. And because leisure is gives them more pleasure, and it's also tied into with virtue. And I mentioned earlier that when Aristotle talks about leisure, he doesn't talk about playing PlayStation or watching Netflix. He talks about learning, philosophizing, doing stuff you should do at a traditional classical school, which is basically exercise, talking with your friends, and studying. And I think that is more interesting. I think also it's just a better conversation, isn't it? If you ask someone what they do for leisure, I think they light up. You see that their body language changes, they shift, their facial expression will change, and it's a better conversation. And also, I wrote an article about this as well, that there's often the case that when someone asks you about what you do for a living, not always the case, I have to say this, because sometimes it's just small talk and people need questions. Often it's the case where it's a kind of status play, isn't it? It's a kind of hierarchical positioning. What do you do? Can I talk to you? Should I talk to this person? Oh, how should I patronize you? Or should I defer to you? It's kind of like a place, Japanese, for example, the language is very status graded. Like you have different words for those who you deem to be above you, and different words for those you deem to be below you professionally. And I feel as though that's a kind of human element to that when we first introduce ourselves to somebody, I want to know where we are in the pecking order. And so when I ask you, who are you and what do you do? We're trying to establish, what should I talk about with you? How should I talk about? And should I be different or not? Actually,
what do you say when you introduce yourself?
I say hi. Who are you? And this is I've got to say that I don't talk the talk in that sense, because small talk is important, at least for the first 5 minutes, because this is it's a kind of it's a dance, it's a negotiation. You're working out what the person is like and what to do next. I have to say, I don't particularly enjoy small talks. There'll come a point that after the small talk's exhausted, I will try to either move it on to something a bit more important, or I'll move to someone else. I, as a general rule, try to be quite honest as much as possible. I'm very frank about my own life, and I like to ask quite honest questions about people. Obviously, I'm not asking about their showering habits, but I like to ask about people's relationships. I like to ask about people's thoughts about morality and about politics and about their childhood and their family and stuff which I think some people find uncomfortably frank. And there have been a few times where people have taken objection to the fact I've been uncomfortably frank, but I often think that as a cost-benefit analysis, I would rather a few people be a little bit uncomfortable than live my life full of dull conversations.
You mentioned politics there. Something in which we hear a lot about in politics is the Overton Window. And what does it mean? So we have the Overton Window from a political sense, but also a philosophical sense. Could you unpack it a bit for us?
Well, yeah, it's kind of similar to the oscillating idea that I said earlier about how we
always podcast.
Yeah, it's a long podcast. Although last week about how human nature and all sorts of things about the human condition shifts between one pole to the other. And the Overton Window is a bit like that. It says that what is the normalized political discourse? What words do we use? What ideas do we discuss in open quotes mainstream media? What are most people talking about? And that is the Overton Window. For example, what ideas do we refer to as being far right? What ideas do we refer to as being far left, socialist, extremist, Marxist? And I think that Overton Window shifts what we consider to be far right and what we label as fascists. It's kind of that's essentially it. That over time, what we read today in the papers as being described as hard left in the 1980s would be described as just being moderate left. That's how it changes. Now, nowadays, it is also slightly confused with another problem, which is the idea that we kind of we label people in as tribes. And so they're labeling people as a fascist or a Nazi, or labeling someone as a communist or a socialist or woke. These are labels that we attach to people because it's part of this kind of tribal game. And the Overton Window is part of that, and it's in mainstream discourse as well, that we label anything which is outside this very narrow view of acceptable political positions, such as there should be a welfare system, that most people who are sane and of an age should vote in a democracy, or we should have an army to protect ourselves. Generic, boring, what's called valence issues that everybody agrees on. That's the tiny Overton Window. Now, anything outside of that is now deemed to be far right, far left, Nazi, woke. And that's a different problem necessarily to the Overton Window. The Overton Window is about what the mainstream media cover. It's for what you see on the front pages, whereas the other issue is about how easily we resort to mudslinging and name calling.
I think it's interesting from a political spectrum position. If we read something like George Orwell's Road to Wigan Pier,
Oh, yeah.
1930s, and George Orwell was a socialist in the 1930s.
Mm.
If we actually look at what he was suggesting and his policies and his diagnosis of the situation, it's kind of like centre-right now. Is there this continual shift gradually to the left on the political spectrum, do you see, from like the last 100 years?
You're outside of my wheelhouse a little bit, if I'm honest. I don't know. I have hunches and intuitions. I don't know.
What would Aristotle
really
say to it?
Yeah, what would Aristotle say? I mean, the state, the kind of state we have today is far more far-reaching than in the ancient world. And the state is involved in far more things today, and also with hand in hand with that, as I said earlier, that the average citizen expects the state to do things that I think even in a generation ago we wouldn't expect the state to do. Like the classic example of this, I'm a parent of young children, is in the school system. It's the question about to what extent do we expect our schools and our teachers to do things that we used to associate with being a parental job. And I think there is a big push towards teachers should be teaching kids to do this, and whereas back in the day, parents. There's lots of schools, primary school teachers or even secondary school teachers who say they've got to teach their children how to do their shoelaces up, for example. And I would argue that's a parent education. It can, teacher can help that and facilitate it, but there are some things which should be at home, should be beyond the powers or the responsibilities of the state. Whereas I think we're pushing lots of things towards the state, and of course, where this is seen most controversially today is in welfare and in health and in pensions as well. The idea that the state is there to constantly look after us all of the time, whereas in the medieval times or even in the late Victorian times, the idea would be that your friends, your family, your village, your parish in the UK would look after you. And in some ways, I kind of miss that time. But then I live in a very lucrative and comfortable part of the country. I have a very nice parish. There's lots of people around here who are kind and look after me and things. But if there were more crime, if there was more hardship around here, I think it'd be a very different flavour. But that's where I see things at the moment, that we expect the state to do much, and the state, therefore, because they're elected by us, feels as though it has to do much more. And that means more money, that means more kind of overreach, and that means promising things that they cannot do as well. That there are some things that the state cannot do, that you have to do on your own as a household, as a small community, or as a unit. Sorry, again, I went outside my wheelhouse and I ended up rambling outside my wheelhouse, so I'll probably get letters for
that. Letters. That's great.
Yeah.
Something in which certainly teachers will be sad about is the lack of manners in their children in the class that come in. And about 1,000 years ago, the Bishop of Winchester, I think, said that the manners maketh man. And certainly 300 years ago, Edmund Burke wrote a lot about manners. What did Burke say, and why are manners important?
Yeah, no, you're right. And I'm glad you mentioned 1,000 years ago, because I should caveat this to say there isn't a degree of kind of the youth today. And that's always existed. Like in Roman times, you hear people moaning about the youth of today being ill-mannered, lazy, feckless fools kind of thing. And so that exists today a little bit. So, we always say that the youth are not like me. But having said that, Burke wrote this piece about manners, and Burke is considered to be the father of traditional conservatism of a small c, because in the UK we have the Conservative Party. And he argues that actually manners and civility are the oil that make the machine work. That if we take away those, then the basic laws that our manners are built upon won't actually function. There are some things that the government can legislate for and should legislate for, but there are some things that should be the remit of manners. And Burke's point is that when you take away them from being a manner, civility, politeness issue and turn them into laws, then actually you make them into, you remove responsibility for them as well. So, I mean, it's ridiculous that the idea of, let's say it was made a law that you shouldn't swear in front of kids in public. That, Burke would argue, that would take the responsibility away from people. And the fact that we don't swear around kids in public is part of civil responsibility and part of civil unity and part of being a social member of society. And what we're seeing today is if people are swearing around kids in public, I don't know if I latch onto that example, that's demonstrative of a lack of civil mentality, and a lack of, it's kind of a difference of a mentality that I could swear if I want to. It's your choice to have kids, therefore I can still swear in public. You didn't have to bring them onto a train. Whereas Burke would argue that once you go down that slope, then essentially democracies won't work because it's lack of trust, lack of participation, and kind of like dangerous really. So we live in a high trust society because of things like that, because people take responsibility for their own behaviors and have a degree of civil-mindedness. When you take that away, when you take away manners and civility, then you have a low trust society, and that's when you have more laws. And of course, that then, as you mentioned earlier, is a slippery slope towards police being everywhere and people being arrested for things that should once be just a matter of gossip or kind of like social, what's the word I want to sort of ostracization. Yeah.
What's a razor? Because there's lots of philosophical razors. What on earth is a razor?
Yeah. Well, there's Occam's razor and there's Hamden's razor. Yeah, I think a razor, I mean, Occam's razor, the reason why it's called Occam's razor is meant to shave away ridiculousnesses. So Occam, William of Occam, this monk, 13th century, maybe put in the show notes, that might be wrong. I think it's 13th century, 12th century. Anyway, a long time ago.
I'll take your word for it.
Occam's, he was in this time of what's called the medieval scholastics, this ridiculous metaphysics. This is the time where people were debating, how many angels can dance on a pinhead kind of thing. That's what people were writing books about, that kind of stuff. And so it was getting out of hand, and he was writing at this time where they were talking about how many substances are there to the universe. Descartes, people know about Descartes. Descartes said that we have two substances, or three if you're reading it carefully. There's mind stuff, there's physical stuff, and there's God stuff, but mostly people talk about the mind and the body stuff. Then they were saying that there's hundreds, thousands of substances, existing in the fabric of the universe. And Occam came along and say, well, this is silly. And so his razor is intended to shave away all these ridiculousnesses, these unprovable extravagances, and go back to what we can prove and what we actually need. And that's where the Occam's razor comes from. So the razor is something where you shave away redundancy, I'd say. And so all the other razors, I'm assuming, kind of take their stock from there. But otherwise, it's a useful heuristic and title, isn't it? People love to say a razor because it makes a good headline, I think. And people like, as a journalist, I know myself that people love razors, rules, methods, laws. So I think people rebadge things as razors because it sells well, I think.
Another one to add into the mix is a paradox, and one of the famous ones is Solomon's paradox. Could you just unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, I think Solomon's paradox is actually not it's a misnamed thing. That's probably my fault entirely. I'm just guilty of what I said earlier. I've branded something for the messaging rather than thing. A paradox is where you have two kind of unreconcilable positions. And Solomon's paradox is all about Solomon, who, in the Bible is this archetypally wise person when it comes to other people, but to his own life was a bit of a trouble. He was very profligate. He was very wasteful of his money. He had a series of wives and children who hated him, and his son was a terrible despot who killed thousands of people, according to the Bible. So he's obviously something went wrong in his own life. So that's why it's a paradox, but it shouldn't be called a paradox, really.
If we're talking about doing philosophy, say with ChatGPT, so that would be a individual thing in which you're doing. Could you also do philosophy with yourself when it comes to Solomon? So you could write out what the problem is that you're struggling with, and then reply to yourself in the sense that you are, say you're 80 years old and looking back on your life. So you could actually internalize Solomon.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think you can.
800 wives or whatever it was.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's why people love journaling, don't they? Like diarizing, because they love to write down their problems and then they can then look at them themselves that way. But it's still difficult, isn't it? It's still difficult to look on your own life because, of course, when you are going through something, you appreciate how complicated and how emotional all of the options are and stuff, which is actually something we should probably appreciate for other people. When we give advice, we should appreciate how complicated it is for them as well. They are feeling it in the same way that we are. So yeah, you definitely can do that. And actually, this is why one of the things I say about philosophy is I often view philosophy as a kind of self-help, self-therapy, because when you read philosophy, and also I should say philosophical novels like Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, whatever, you externalize, you see ideas which are obviously about your life, but you see them as if from outside, and it allows you to then reflect on your own existence by seeing it in this kind of philosophical, objective, external way. So yes.
A rousing conclusion. Now, Jonny, just as we draw to the end, because I realise that you have many things to write and many things to edit, which
Thank you.
looking forward to reading them sometime next year.
Thank you. Yeah, give it a plug.
Your 3 book recommendations for anyone whose interest has been piqued in this conversation, who has spent some time on your page and quite likes what you say. What would be your 3 book recommendations?
3 book recommendations, eh? I would say, I've said it before and I'll say it again, but Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, because I think the way Aristotle writes and the content of his book are both brilliant. Like, he is a philosopher, but he has the art of dragging you along in the argument without you thinking you're being dragged along in the argument. It's one of those books where you put it down and say, well, Aristotle's clearly right. And then you go away online and realize there might be a few problems with him. But also, actually, I actually am quite Aristotle leaning. So I like his argument. So Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, number 1. Number 2, I would say Simone de Beauvoir, one of her works, either The Second Sex, or I would probably say the Ethics of Ambiguity, which is a more general philosophy. So Simone de Beauvoir's Ethics of Ambiguity, I always recommend that. And then something for a bit different flavor, I would say the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu, because it is philosophy from a different tradition. It's a different kind of philosophy in the sense that it's not premises laid out, an argument laid out premises to conclusion. It's more of a reflective. They talk in these these very enigmatic, short aphorisms, and I think it's a different way of doing philosophy that everyone should do as well, and it's fun, I would say.
And then, speaking of books, you have an exciting project in which you're working on. Can you tell us much about that?
Yes, I can, depending upon when this podcast is being released, I'm afraid.
This week, so probably not very much.
No, I can't. So all I can say is I'm working on a very secret project to do with an ancient philosophy that I believe gives the recipe for a lasting, sustainable happiness that doesn't involve grinding yourself into a heart attack in your 60s, I'd say.
What a bombshell.
What a bombshell. Yes.
Jonny, thank you so much for your time. I've really enjoyed ping-ponging around different ideas and people with you, and thank you very much for coming on.
Thanks, Joe. That's great.